Welcome back to this week's topic on population and urbanization. So in the first half, I talked about population growth, not only in world, but also Korea. Or in the case of Korea, it was more of a population change, not necessarily growth, because Korea's population has been in decline since 2020. And also I also talked about the views on population growth. And now I will talk about urbanization, which sort of goes hand in hand with population growth. An important aspect of social change and population growth over the centuries has been urbanization, or the rise and growth of cities. Urbanization is the process by which an increasing proportion of a population lives in cities. Urbanization has had important consequences for many aspects of social, political, and economic life. The question is, how is an urban area defined? So I think what I have to tell you in the next few slides will come across as a big surprise because of this. There is currently no universal definition of what urban means. Again, believe it or not, this is true. You know, it is said that globalization means many things, but one of them is also said to be a standardization of many things we're familiar with. For example, the metric system. The standardized time and to go back to the metric system, all over the world, many different cultures have their own ways with, measuring weight, distance, and whatever, right? But they have become standardized, right? So that, for example, Korea uses the metric system, and a lot of cultures do the same. In view of that, it is interesting to notice how, when it comes to sort of defining what an urban area is, that there is no universal definition. Again, I myself find this very amusing. The UN reports figures, so the figures you see made by the UN, it's not that UN has its own criteria. UN simply reports figures released by countries, okay, their governments. The problem, however, with all the country reports is that countries adopt very different definitions of urbanization. Some countries use minimum population thresholds, while others use population density, infrastructure development, employment type, or simply the population of predefined cities. The following table highlight the varied definitions across a selection of countries. When we look at the frequency at which a given threshold level is used by a country, 2,000 or 5,000 inhabitants were jointly the most frequently adopted threshold. However, the variation across countries is vast. Sweden and Denmark, for example, set this threshold at only 200 inhabitants. Japan, on the other hand, it's at 50,000. And I think Korea is 20,000. To elaborate, in Sweden and Denmark, a living area or an area is classified as an urban area when there are more than only 200 inhabitants. But the threshold for Japan is 50,000. Okay. So you can see how, so as you can see in this particular table, so all these countries have different definitions as to what urban area means. Okay. So so Argentina, it's 20,000, 2,000, Sweden, and there's Japan. So I think in Korea, cities, which is also called a shi, it definitely needs, I think, 20,000 inhabitants. So, I don't know if I have this uploaded in the lecture notes, but if you just type national definition of urban, I'm sure you'll get a hit. This is the minimal number of inhabitants for a settlement to classify as an urban area. So the darker the color, the higher the number of inhabitants necessary to qualify as an urban area. There is increasing evidence for the negative impacts of urbanization on biodiversity, most directly in the form of habitat loss. Urbanization and related land consumption are one of the main causes of, there's a typo there, main causes of ecosystem, I guess, destruction. Urbanization is a major threat to biodiversity and is responsible for species extinctions and biotic homogenization. The disturbance created by urbanization destroys the habitat of a wide array of unique endemic species and often creates an attractive habitat for relatively few species able to adapt to urban conditions. So I think this particular table could be moved up under zero population growth section. But you get an idea as to how much forest and wild grassland and shrubs have been shrunk or destroyed by human needs. This is a share of the population living in urban areas, 10,000 before the Common Era to 2000. Urbanization over the past 500 years for selected areas and countries. Until the 18th century, most people throughout the world were living and working on small farms. The few existing cities were mainly market towns, but the industrialization, again, changed the nature of the city. So industrialization not only greatly impacted the population growth, but also the growth of urbanization or the rapidity of urbanization. So cities became more numerous and much larger during industrialization as people moved to be near factories and other sites of industrial production. Over time, technological innovations made it possible for cities to expand. And what am I talking about here? Talking about the cast iron in building construction and the invention of the elevator enables cities to expand vertically, while other inventions such as trains and railroads and automobiles have made it possible for cities to expand horizontally as well. Today, urbanization means not only that more people live in cities, but also that today's cities are much larger. According to the UN, in 2008, for the first time in history, more than half of the world's population were living in urban areas. The figure is expected to rise to 60% by 2030. So again, for the first time ever in human history, urban population exceeded that of the rural population, and that happened in 2008. And as you can see in this particular figure, the red shaded pie graph is the proportion of the urban population, whereas the green shaded pie is the proportion of the rural population. And as you can see, back in 1950, only about 30% of the world population were living in urban areas, but the proportion increased to 47% in 2000. And by 2030, the proportion of the population, world population living in urban areas will exceed 61%. And if you see the next slide, you can see how more developed regions, urbanization rate is higher for more developed regions, as you can see in between. The comparisons are made between the two figures, right? So just for example, by 2030, whereas only 57% of people living in less developed regions will be living in urban areas, the proportion of their counterparts living in developed regions, the proportion will be much greater at 83.7%. Okay, the next section, I turn to the types of urban settlements, and I think it's good to know that there are more than like suburbs and cities that most of you are familiar with. So there are these different types of urban settlements that are used by scholars and also policymakers. I guess the most obvious and popular and well-known is the city, right? So the typical working definitions for small city populations start at around 100,000 people. But again, countries differ in awarding a city status. Okay, so it's just like urban area, city, there's no universal standard. Suburbs are the communities surrounding cities. Okay, and there's also a thing called exurbs, something I'm sure many of you are hearing for the first time. And it's communities that exist outside the ring of suburbs and are typically populated by even wealthier families who want more space. So if you want to visualize this, think of a Hollywood movie where this rich man or woman taking a train ride to work at Manhattan office, right? So the train ride would be like over an hour or 2 hours, right? So that would mean that person is living in a exurb. So that's further away from the center of city than suburbs, right? So usually bigger house and bigger, front and backyards, right? So this is what is called Burgess' model of a sort of urban development, where right at the center you have a central business district surrounded by a transitional zone, and this is where typically lower middle class to middle class people live, right? Because that's where there's a deteriorating housing, there are factories, and some housing's just abandoned, right? And that is surrounded by working class zone, orange shaded zone, and that's working class zone. And the next ring is that looks more like suburbs, right? Well, the commuter zone Well, you get the picture, right? That's Burgess model. And then there is metropolis, metropolitan area comprising of the central city and surrounding smaller cities, suburbs, and exurbs, which are connected economically, politically, and socially. So from now on, when you see a population of, let's say, New York or population of LA, make sure you look into see whether it refers to the population of the city itself or alone, or whether it's metropolitan LA or metropolitan New York population, because there's a huge difference, right? The world's largest metropolitan cities megacities are a very large metropolitan area with 10 million or more residents. As of 2017, there were 47 megacities in the world. Uh, as of 2017, there were the world's largest metropolitan cities are Tokyo, number one, followed by Shanghai, Jakarta, Delhi. So Seoul is right up there. Other notable metropolitan areas, New York at 23.9 million, LA, Moscow, Bangkok, London, and Paris. And the last terminology that we use to sort of describe an area is a megalopolis. And it's a Greek word meaning large city or great city. It's a long chain of continuous metropolitan areas or a region made up of several large cities and their surrounding areas. Question is, can you think of any examples of megalopolis in the USA? So if we were having an in-person class, I could have given you time to think about the examples of megalopolis in the USA, but it suffice to just tell you that there are several megalopolises in the USA, and here are the examples. First, Northeast Megalopolis. This is the eastern seaboard of the US, including Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Second example is the southern California, where the LA metropolitan area, San Diego, Santa Barbara area are all sort of connected together to form a megalopolis. And here is a pictorial image. So there's on the far right, northeast, a little bit down below, there is Petermann Atlantic megalopolis. And there's the Texas Triangle, and there's Northern California linking San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, San Jose, and so on, right? And then in Southern California. Okay? So there are, you can guess roughly a handful, right, in the USA. Are there any megalopolises in Korea? Yes, it's half of a country of the southern peninsula. So Incheon, Seoul, Suwon, Daejeon, Daegu, Busan. Okay, that's from Seoul to the southeastern coast. Okay, that's one. And the second example is 인천, 서울, 대전, 전주, 광주. And so that'll be from Incheon, Seoul to the southwestern uh, city of Gwangju. Okay. And what about megalopolises in China? And of course, there are quite a few, as they say. There are 13, including Pearl River Delta megalopolis. And that megalopolis alone has over 55 million population. Okay. So I hope you have some good ideas as to, all these different criteria, sort of classifying different types of urban settlements. Okay. Next is the section on views on urban life. So what is dealt with under this section is this. So as you saw, since 2008, more people of the world live in urban areas than in rural areas for the first time ever in human history. So what this particular section does is, so there are more people living in urban areas, and there must be some qualitative changes, right, between the urban lifestyle and rural lifestyle, right? So this is what they do. How people living in urban areas are experiencing their life differently than they would have living in rural areas. Okay. So the first sort of theory is being put forth by Ferdinand Tönnies. And his theory is called Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And what is meant by Gemeinschaft is this. In literal translation, it means community in German. Okay, so it refers to a small traditional community characterized by personal relationships, strong sense of solidarity, common identity, and shared values. Okay, that's Gemeinschaft. But Gemeinschaft sort of becomes a Gesellschaft when there is through an urbanization. And Gesellschaft roughly means association or society, and it refers to a large impersonal urban areas characterized by formal relationships, contracts rather than personal relationships, individualism rather than sort of collectivism, and the person of self-interest and isolation. Okay. So, if so I could show you what I just said in this particular table. Okay, so I'll give you a few seconds to review. Okay. Okay, so it's definitely more exhaustive list of what I mentioned earlier was brief, but this is quite a long list of how things are different under Gemeinschaft situation versus Gesellschaft setting, again, which refers to lifestyle or relationship in urban areas. Okay. The second theorist who has theorized about the changes in the lifestyle of urban setting is Durkheim. And the terms he used are mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. So according to Durkheim, societies can be divided into two types, distinguished by, again, mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. So according to Durkheim, pre-industrial societies are held together by mechanical solidarity. And, and mechanical solidarity is characterized by small homogeneous population, people sharing the same values, strong group identity, and low or minimal division of labor. And according to Durkheim, as the division of labor becomes more complex, mechanical solidarity gives way to organic solidarity, and that's modern urbanized society, and is characterized by larger population in larger geographical area, complex division of labor, functional interdependence, interpersonal social relationships, and individualism. So just like with the Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, and you should look up mechanical and organic solidarity in the internet if you're not fully sure of what the differences are between these two sets of terminologies or concepts. Okay, so please do that. Again, look them up on the internet. Okay, so that's this is something I got from the internet, which distinguishes the differences between the two types of solidarity. Okay. I sort of included that because I think it's a nice summary. Okay. The third sociologist to sort of theorize about how urban life is different from rural life. Anyway, the third sociologist to sort of delve into this is George Simmel. And for him, he's sort of a concept is called blase urbanite. And what did he mean by this? According to Simmel, individuals experience cities as a collision of people, objects, and events. So living in urban centers is akin to one's senses working overtime. To avoid being overwhelmed by all this stimulation, urbanites develop a blasé attitude, which is to tune out and becoming insensitive to much of what goes on around them. This blasé attitude is a strategy to cope with sensory or psychic overload of living in urban centers. So they tune out what they find overburdening, that is, for example, not aiding strangers who need help, so as to avoid troubling oneself. The detached, don't get involved attitude is frequently cited as a part of big city life. Ever so often you hear of news when someone is attacked, someone is being victimized, and oftentimes we, turn our heads away from what's happening. And that is what blase attitude is. We tune out. We don't want to care because life in urban area itself is too complicated, too burdening. Like on this slide, without knowing, our senses are working overtime. And again, compared to people living in rural areas, that is so true. Okay. So what enables us to adjust and live more comfortably in urban areas, according to Zimmel, is that we tune out. We don't get involved. We become insensitive. Okay. So even this particular concept, or the sociologist, you could look up the internet. Okay. And yes, there have been a number of recorded incidents in which people have been mugged or beaten in plain view of pedestrians who refuse to help the victim. An often cited example from the US is the case of Kitty Genovese, a young woman who was murdered while 37 residents of nearby apartments in New York who heard her cries did nothing. I mean, we have the specific number of residents because this is based on police report. Okay, because after this murder case took place, police went around the vicinity or the apartments, surveying, asking people whether they heard or saw what was happening, and it was found out that 37 residents actually heard her cries, but they did nothing. Subsequent research on bystander apathy revealed that the presence of many other people tends to diffuse the sense of responsibility. And that is, we're all less likely to take action if we have reason to believe that someone else will do so. Okay. More recently, in October 2021, a woman was raped on a subway in Philadelphia while onlookers reportedly recorded video with their cell phones, but did not intervene or call 911. This shocking news like this makes us rethink what it is to be a human. I don't know if I'm sort of saying too much, but anyway. Urbanites also minimize involvement with others by removing themselves from easy contact with others. For example, travel by private automobile, live in segregated neighborhoods, filter phone calls with various apps, and filter visitors through CCTV. When I ask my colleagues who drive to school rather than taking subways, number one reason is always, again, I've had this personal interviews with so many people who drive to work or to school. Again, it's always the same answer. They don't want to run into people. They don't want to see others. They don't want to bump into others, right? They just want to be in their privacy. So they follow unspoken but definite rules about how much distance to keep from others in particular situations, like where to sit, like on buses or in libraries, or where to stand, like in an elevator, and even how to walk, right? So these are extreme cases, but if you look at these pictures, I don't know if she actually did this to put on some kind of a show for others to, take a picture. But I don't know if, again, my question is, I don't know if she does this on a daily basis, or whether this was done one time to make a point. Okay? Same thing there. this just makes a point, right? This is a personal space that that person needs. Well, I have this included because I'm, without knowing whether the two people know each other, but if you were to imagine whether, like, if these were two strangers, then one of them definitely is violating the personal space of the other person, right? Anyway, this is the figure showing uh, like different distances we have for our personal space, right? For intimate space, like family and lover, the distance is only, not even a meter, right? For friends and extended family, it's between 0.75 meter to 1.2 meters. Acquaintances and colleagues, 1.2 meters to 3.6 meters. And with strangers, you want a distance of more than 3.6 meters. Okay, something like that. Well, having said all these, urbanization in Korea. By 1789, there are only three cities with more than 20,000 residents in Korea, and the proportion of urban population was a mere 3.3%. So if I could show you some pictures as to how unurban, how rural Korea was, or rural looking. Look at this. This is central downtown Seoul back in the 1890s. Next, Seoul in 1903, about the same time. But around that time, the one on the left is Paris in 1900, and on the right, London in 1900. But just amazing is the next picture. New York in 1900. 1900. And remember how Seoul looked at the same time, right? Anyway, this is what Seoul looks like now. Very urban, very modern, very global, and very crowded, congested roads. Good thing we have one of the best subway systems in the world. Anyway, there have been three stages of urbanization in Korea. And the first stage happened between 1910 and 1945. And this happens to coincide with the Japanese colonial rule. Urban residents during the Joseon dynasty, Joseon period, that's 1392 to 1910, accounted for only 3 to 5% of the total population, but increased to 10 to 20% between 1910 and 1945. Urbanization at the time was closely linked to Japanese needs. Until 1935, Korea served mainly as a supply of rice. So that's why cities like Mokpo and Daejeon in the south were developed as important centers for rice supply. After 1935, when Japan, began its imperialistic endeavor by invading China, Korea served as a base of war supplies. So as Japan geared itself to invade mainland China, new industrial centers were created in the north, including Pyongyang. The second stage of urbanization in Korea was from 1945 to the end of the 1950s. Growth of cities is closely linked to large influx of refugees from the north, returnees from Siberia, China, and Japan, most of whom were sent there as forced laborers. So 2.2 million Koreans returned following the liberation. 1.3 million from Japan, 330,000 from Manchuria, 100,000 from other parts of China, and so on. Also, around 1 million refugees from North Korea came to South Korea. Okay, so when you could be so the 2.2 million Koreans following the returning to South Korea following the liberation, I should say that it includes or including 1.3 million from Japan, 330,000 from Manchuria, and 100,000 from other parts of China. And so the rest come from elsewhere, right? Like from Russia, for example. South Korean population in 1945 was 16 million, but it grew to 19 million by 1949. That is an annual increase of 6%, the highest in Korean history. Okay. The deteriorating rural economy also induced massive rural outmigration to cities, particularly Seoul. The third stage of urbanization took place from early 1960s to the 1980s. And this is a period of rapid industrialization, which led to rapid urbanization. One of the major features of urban migration in the 1960s was the migration to one city, that's Seoul. Between 1960 and 1970, more than 65% of all migrants headed to Seoul. And starting in the mid-1970s, there has been a diversification in the destination of migrants. Migration to Seoul decreased, while other cities, including Busan, began to grow considerably. So this does highlight how the population in rural areas began to decline, whereas the population growth of Seoul metropolitan area has been steady since 1955, as was the population of urban areas. Okay, the next section is the characteristics and problems of urbanization in Korea. And well, let's just get right to it. Compared to rural area dwellers, city dwellers all over the world have higher levels of income and education, greater social mobility, smaller families, greater diversity, less stable marriages, meaning they have a higher divorce rate. And they also have higher reported rates of alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, and suicide. So these are the characteristics of all urban dwellers all over the world. These are universal characteristics, okay, not unique to just urban dwellers in Korea. Anyway, the following are the characteristics and problems of urbanization in Korea. So right now, over 90% of the total population in Korea live in cities with more than 20,000 residents. There are more apartments than houses as far as resident type of residents go. Okay. In fact, 90% of new housing units were in the form of apartments in the 1990s and 2000s. So I have some pictures. This is what a typical area of Seoul looks like, right? Because we live in a small land, and because cities tend to be crowded, there is said to be a shortage of public facilities like parks, libraries, recreational centers, sports facilities like tennis courts, swimming pools, and ice rinks, for example, right? Fourth, the lack of affordable housing. Um, Housing prices in cities, especially in Seoul, are very high, uh, and the lack of affordable housing has generated this new term, shelter poor. Okay, I'm gonna just skip this part. Well, I can maybe talk about how the maybe I should show you this, where uh, the rate of home ownership in Korea is said to be lower than other developed countries. For example, as of 2015, the proportion of Koreans who own their own house was 56.8%. But if you look at the figures for other developed countries, for example, Canada, close to 70% own their own house. Australia, the same. Great Britain, the same. USA, slightly lower at about 65%. So you can see how from this particular comparison, the home ownership rate for Korea is relatively lower compared to other developed countries. Okay. Next characteristic or problem is the pollution. Because maybe I should update this. It's not a low priority, uh, but rather, you know, we do. The fact of the matter is, we do have a poor air quality due to a large number of power plants which use coals and disproportionate of number of vehicles using diesel fuel, and which is quite true. And we also have a large number of waste incinerating plants. Whereas some countries still use landfills to bury waste, Korea simply ran out of spaces to bury waste. So every non-renewable waste that is generated in Korea, we burn. So that leads to air pollution, of course. Okay, so these are uh, waste incinerating plants that you probably would not have noticed. You see this little tower at the center? That's a waste incinerator. Okay, and both of them there, of course, the same thing. Waste incinerator. Same thing. It looks fancy, but again, the purpose is to burn garbages. Okay. And there's also a crowding phenomenon. Cities are crowded in at least two ways. Residential crowding, that is large number of people living in small spaces, and household crowding. City apartments are typically small, and crowding is associated with higher levels of stress, depression, and aggression. People living in Seoul are said to have one of the highest stress levels in the world due to high population density. So Seoul has a high population density. So as of 2021, over 17,700 persons per square kilometers. And if you compare that with the national average, that's more than 30 times higher than the national average, right? Well, this picture really captures how crowded subway can be during rush hours, right? It's not like this all the time, of course. Rush hour. Seventh, crime. Cities have much higher rates of violent and property crime than do small towns or rural areas. Crime rates in large cities are at least 2 to 3 times higher than those in rural areas. Korea is no exception, but its overall crime rate is one of the lowest in the world. As of 2022, the crime rate was 26.68 per 100,000 population, and that's 21st lowest in the world. This is slightly lower, higher than what I shared with you before, I think. Anyway, Qatar has the world's lowest crime rate at 12.13 per 100,000 population, and you can see other countries' figures. Okay. Eighth characteristic of urbanization in Korea is what can be called Seoul-based urbanization. We have this nickname, Seoul Republic, because Seoul, or should I say Seoul, Metro Seoul, has everything to be like a country, because, as you can see below, excuse me, Seoul and the capital region is the country's economic, social, cultural, and political center. For example, there's an excessive population in the capital region. Seoul comprises only not even 1% of the total land in South Korea, but its population comprises 19.4% of the total population. And the capital region comprises 8.5% of the total land, but more than half of the population live in the region. And so the capital region is the fifth largest metropolitan area in the world. Okay. So this is something I mentioned earlier, right? So this is population trends of the capital region in selected years from 1980 to 2020. Okay. And this is the population ratios of the capital region versus the rest of the country. So continuing with the Seoul-based urbanization, the second characteristic is the excessive concentration of economic activities. 96% of the headquarters of large conglomerates are based in the capital region. I compare that with the USA because, for example, when it comes to the US, headquarters are not all in Washington, right? They are in New York, they're in Seattle, they're in Dallas, they're in Denver. They're just all over the country. Although there is some concentration in certain areas, but it's safe to say that they're all over the country. Whereas in Korea, it's practically full concentration in the capital region. 80% of all credit card transactions take place in the capital region. 68% of savings, 46, 69% of all manufacturing, and 56.3% of all service industry work are all concentrated in the region. And at any given period, around 65% of new employments are created in the capital region. So I don't know if this is enough to show you that pretty much everything is concentrated in the capital region. But well, this is another indicator of everything being concentrated in the capital region. Okay. The next slide also shows that the capital region is the center of Korea, and it has to do with culture and also education. Okay. 39% of all the universities are found in the capital region, and most of the prestigious universities are found in the region, especially in Seoul. Okay. Also, comparison with the USA is pertinent because where are, let's say, Ivy League universities found? None is found in the capital. Okay, and they are found in many different areas, states, and also different towns, right? And also you have MIT, which is in Boston, California Institute of Technology, one of the most highly rated educational institutions is found in California. And then there's also University of California, found in LA and so on, right? So that is so different from Korea. Fourth characteristic of Seoul-based urbanization, Seoul-based urbanization is the concentration of amenities and others in the region, and this has to do with like half of all medical facilities found in the capital region, about half of all the cars found in the region, and the last one is what we call Gangnam Republic. So I talked about all these things being concentrated in the Seoul region or the capital region, but within the capital region, then there's also Gangnam, that Gangnam area that stands out. Okay, whether it's education or economic activities, housing prices, and so on. I'll just move on to the last section, and that is the comparison of urbanization in the West and Korea. In the West, the characteristics of the urbanization in Korea are like this. In the West, industrial cities began to take shape since the 1770s, which means urbanization has been in progress for some 250 years. Second characteristic, industrialization and urbanization went hand in hand. Third, urbanization took place along with economic, technological, political, and social changes. Fourth characteristic, the way of thinking changed as well. Fifth characteristic, urbanization is more of an even process for many urban centers, including small to mid-sized cities. Another characteristic is the better urban planning. And the last characteristic is suburbanization. Okay, so cities usually have suburban areas located nearby. Now, in comparison, Korea's urbanization is different from the West in the following ways. It took just 50 years to urbanize. So compared to like 250 years that, Western cities took, Korea just 50 years. Compared to the West, urbanization took place prior to industrialization. Third, political, economic, administrative systems are relatively modern, but people's psyche and thoughts are still steeped in tradition, leading to conflict between modernity and tradition. Fourth characteristic of urbanization in Korea is that urbanization is relatively uneven, as only a few large cities receive disproportionate number of migrants, called suburbanization. Fifth characteristic is relative lack of urban planning. That's why when you, for example, drive around cities in Korea, instead of straight roads and streets, many of them are winded because they stuck with the old sort of a travel path rather than planning it anew, right? And lastly, in comparison to its overall level of industrialization, Korea is said to be over-urbanized, as more people live in the cities than can reasonably supported by the infrastructures. Okay, and this is true in most developing countries. All right, so thank you, and this concludes this week's lectures on population and urbanization. Thank you.